failed, they went to brawn. And so then they turned to their swords eventually, right? First it was boycotting them, starving them, and then driving them out of Mecca, and eventually went to swords. Imam al-Baqillani, rahimahullah, he makes a beautiful point here. Baqillani has one of the most famous books in Islamic history on the inimitability of the Quran. I'jazul Quran. The Quran has stumped people, cannot be imitated. I'jazul Quran, it's called. And so he has a book by that name. And he says there, of the greatest proofs that they were failed by their words, it even sounds nice in English too, even though he said it in Arabic. Of the greatest proofs that they were failed by their words was the fact that they felt forced to reach for their swords. I hope you caught that. The fact that you reach for your sword means you were failed by your words. Like, why would you spend your money and subject your chiefs to being killed and also kill your former tribesmen and sort of tribal strength and tribal loyalty was really big for them. It was like a survival mechanism and a source of honor. And why would you do all of that if you could pay a lesser price? So the fact that they reached for their swords was of the proofs that they were truly failed by their words. I want to share with you quickly this quote from Angelica Neuwirth. Angelica Neuwirth, she wrote this 6-volume commentary on the Quran. She's a German professor, and she's one of the foremost non-Muslim experts on Quran. So it's not just Al-Walid. This is the whole point. This is not just Walid. She said this in an interview. This is not in the book. She said, no one has succeeded. And this is right. I really think that the Quran has even brought Western researchers embarrassment who weren't able to clarify how suddenly in an environment where there were not any appreciable written texts appeared this Quran out of nowhere, right? With its richness of ideas and its magnificent wordings. And so that is a point for you to sort of put in your artillery belt, or I want you to digest before we move past linguistics, that whether we're talking about, pre-modern times or in modern times, those who are true experts on the language and familiar with the Quran know, regardless of whether they admit it's from God or not, they know this book is a masterpiece that cannot be matched. Any questions about this? Can you say who the author was that said this and wrote the book? There's actually, this class is being recorded. And I'm projecting slides. So inshallah, when you go to the recordings, it's all on screen. So it's Angelica Neuwirth, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Any questions about this point? Someone can say, yeah, but technically it's not over. It's not over. Like maybe someone in 100, who knows, 1,000 years will come and outdo the Quran. So you can't actually say the Quran challenged and everybody failed because, there's still people around. What would your response to this be, by the way? Think with me. I'm playing advocate of Shaitan before he gets locked up for Ramadan. Right? If someone were to say, devil's advocate here, if someone were to say, but it's not over yet, maybe this challenge will one day be met, what would your response be? Come on, people, you're 100 deep. I'm sure someone's got something thoughtful to say and they're just shy.
Astaghfirullah. Never. Astaghfirullah.
Astaghfirullah. Okay. You're going to say that? You're going to say that to yourself, but how about them? Like, what are we going to do?
Just bring on the challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, it is like
that they have to produce something like they was originally said.
Yeah. Okay. Jazakallah khair. Muhammad, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say that this is something you can say like for pretty much all the time. If it's true that it can be challenged, then you will never see someone, you'll never find someone, and you're gonna die. You're gonna on misguidance. It's not really an argument, if you think about it. It's just, well, no one has done it yet. Well, no one's gonna do it if the claim is true. So it's nothing to measure against. If that makes sense.
Right. Theoretical plausibility is not something that we actually operate on, right? Because that
Exactly.
would make you paralyzed. How do I know I exist? That's called radical skepticism. How do I know I'm not colorblind and that green light is actually red? Maybe I should stop, right? And so for someone to be willing to entertain these things when the the foremost experts in this language for 1,500 years agree, right? Whether they're Muslim or not, and you're saying, yeah, but technically there's still some time on the clock. And when you reach for straws like that, and this is an important point, that this is for us more than anything else, because you finding the truth is very different than you wanting the truth. And so just because you have the greatest, arsenal of proofs for why the Quran is from God doesn't mean the person you have a conversation with will actually accept it, because if you bring him the angels, he might say, I'm intoxicated, right? If he spoke to the dead and they told him we saw paradise and the hellfire, we can tell them maybe you were hallucinating. The Quran actually says this, right? So you got to be careful of even being stained by those whose hearts are infected with radical skepticism. Okay, so that's sort of just proving by referring to authority that the Quran is an absolute masterpiece, right? I really like this this explanation on how the Quran, sort of the rationalization now. Another explanation, this was given by Dr. Bassem Sayyah, to help us appreciate this. Like, how can the Quran, when its language, ever qualify to be a miracle? So he says, I'm going to read it off the slide for those who aren't seeing the slide. The miraculousness of the Quran lies in this very paradox. Paradox means contradiction. The paradox of its being truly Arabic and its being at one and the same time a new language. He says, and this might appear to be illogical. He says, however, the logic of miracle inheres in precisely the fact that it surpasses logic. So a miracle that rests on logic ceases to be a miracle. So let me try to unpack that for you. He's saying that, look, you need to understand, it's not just like people are aesthetically or subjectively just saying, yeah, Quran's awesome, I really love the Quran. Quran's language is so exquisite, it's such a masterpiece. No, it's not subjective. He's saying the Quran is a sophisticated, Arabic is a sophisticated, mature, advanced language with very strict structure, very strict rules, right? It's not arbitrary and subjective. I feel this is eloquent. He says, and despite it being like that, the Quran broke away from it. The Quran does not respect these rules. The Quran does not use the conventions of Arabic that have been so well refined. And at the same time, nobody denies that it's so clearly Arabic. So it's totally Arabic, but it's totally not. It's not Arabic because it doesn't fall in line with any Arabic anyone has ever used before the Quran, by the way, or ever used after the Quran. The style of the Quran has never been used. It doesn't line up to any of the conventions of Arabic, the compositional structure of Arabic. At the same time, it's so crystal clear. That's what he's trying to say. How does that work? How is it so clearly Arabic, but it doesn't line up with the Arabic we know whatsoever? And that is why, the great poets like Labid ibn Rabi'a and others are now retiring. They heard the Quran and said, wow, I'm never going to say poetry again. Some of them are becoming Muslim like Labid. It's truly amazing what the Quran did. I hope that sort of helped you give another angle of how to speak to this point. There's one last thing I want to do before I walk away from language, from linguistics, which is comparing, or not comparing, actually, the Prophet ﷺ or the Quran's language with the language of Shakespeare. So some background on this issue. One of the academic experts on Islam, who is non-Muslim, he's an Orientalist scholar, so basically those who study Islam to critique it, his name was Arthur J. Arbery. Arthur J. Arbery was, interestingly, so well-versed in Quran, non-Muslim, that he actually has his own translation of the Quran. And I hear it's pretty good. I haven't flipped through it myself. You can Google Quran translated by Arthur J. Arbery and you'll have it. So just to show you that he's not some pushover. In any case, He says, though, I believe he says this in the intro of the translation. He says that just because the Quran is in a league of its own linguistically, so he admits it. Here's another one, just admitting it, doesn't mean the Muslims should get carried away and say it's supernatural. They're exaggerating. So you get it? He's agreeing that linguistically it's unmatched, it's unparalleled, but that doesn't mean it's divine. He goes, that's a stretch. And then he argues that he goes, look, every language has its like masterpiece. You have the sonnets of Shakespeare in English. You have the Iliad of Homer in Greek. No one ever said the sonnets of Shakespeare are from God. No one ever said, the Iliad of Homer is from God. And so maybe because I got dragged through English literature as an undergrad, I have a particular bone to pick with this line of argument. Maybe that's my impetus subconsciously. But when he says something like this, he is like really, really overlooking humongous differences. Why that comparison doesn't work. Why you can never really compare the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, with Shakespeare. And so here are 10 points. They're adapted from and inspired by Dr. Sami Amiri's work in Barahin al-Nubuwah, a very long, extensive book he has on the proofs of prophethood, and also in particular responding to Orientalist critiques against the Prophet Muhammad والسلام. So he speaks to this point, and it was really nice what he did there. And I just sort of built on it a little bit by consulting some experts in the space and then moving it into the English language. So credit goes to him after Allah Azza wa Jal. Let's get to it. So he mentions, or let me just jump to the English after product. We mentioned 10 major differences between the Prophet ﷺ and Shakespeare. Every time I do this, people pay attention. Every time I do this, someone has to get up and say, Astaghfirullah, it's an insult to the Prophet ﷺ that you even compare him to Shakespeare. That's not what I'm doing. I'm telling you why Arthur Arbery is wrong for comparing the Prophet ﷺ to Shakespeare. Okay? Of course, there's a world of difference between our Prophet ﷺ and even Muslims, even righteous Muslims, let alone Shakespeare. How miraculous that Allah can grant whoever He wills the ability to recite, memorize, learn Arabic, anyone from any nation. Yes, we're going to get to that. Tahira. Jazakallah khair for that ad. Beautiful. So, first and foremost, who had a formal education? Who had access to books and libraries? Shakespeare was formally trained in English, in Latin. The Prophet ﷺ was not formally trained, did not read and write even in Arabic. Okay. That's number one. Number two, who wrote for a living? That was Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a professional playwright. Okay? That means he got paid to sit and refine his craft, production after production. He's improving his skill day in and day out. He has the ability to dedicate time. He made money off of this, right? So he wrote for a living. The Prophet ﷺ was a shepherd and a tradesman, and never did any of this, never said a verse of poetry, a full couplet of poetry in his life. Number three, who brought to the world a new compositional structure? Remember that? Back to this point. Who used a brand new utilization of the language? Let me compare. The Prophet ﷺ, we already said, he doesn't conform to the conventions of Arabic. Shakespeare's not the guy who invented sonnets. Those of you who study English literature, poetry, you know this. Sonnets were not, they existed for hundreds of years before Shakespeare. He was just one of the better, employers of sonnets. That's it. He was one of the best people that wrote in sonnet form. You guys know what sonnet form is. Like, you guys remember haiku and sonnets, and there's like a certain measure you have to live up to, right? Compositional structure, how many syllables and whatnot. And so Shakespeare used something pre-existing. The Prophet ﷺ used something that never existed before and no one was able to match it after. So he brought a new compositional structure to the world. That's number three. Number four, it's what's called stylometry. Stylometry is a big, flex word that you can flex with. Astaghfirullah. It's a clunky word for basically what they call author discrimination. It's a mathematical method. Basically, how it works is you take everything I've ever written. All right, let's make believe. How much you know? Everything I've ever written on Facebook and whatever you can get your hands on of my writing, and in book, whatever. And then you punch it into a software. So the software begins to pick up on my writing style, what kind of words I use, what kind of length of my sentences, all of that, right? Now, the idea here is 1,000 years from now, someone uncovers, as if they care, but someone uncovers a manuscript that says written by Muhammad Shinawi. So you put it into the software and it measures according to writing styles, metric of stylometry, right? It tells you, yeah, that actually is Muhammad's writing. It matches up well with his patterns. Or that's not Muhammad Shinawi's writing. He doesn't write like that. You get it? And so this is, by the way, how they discriminated that some of the books of the Bible, or the books of the Bible that are attributed even to Paul of Tarsus, are actually not the works of Paul. They can't be written by Paul. And so basically what they did here is some did about, I believe it was 12 experiments where they compared the language of the Quran with the language of Hadith. Okay? You take Sahih al-Bukhari, throw it in. Then you throw the Quran in. How much do they match up stylistically? And they found like a huge disparity. Like I believe it was something like 60 to 70% of the time, depending on what you're controlling for or measuring, the words of the Quran don't show up in the Hadith at all. Or the words of the Quran don't show up in the Hadith at all. I forget which of the two right now. So what does that offer you? That offers you basically like a mathematical or objective way to say conclusively, there's no way the Quran and the Hadith both come from Muhammad. They can't come from the same source. You know, I'm only saying this because we're not expert Arabs. And so like the people around the Prophet Muhammad already knew it. They already knew. We live with this guy, this man for 40 years. We know how he talks. We know everything about him. He speaks like us, you know, day-to-day talk, everyday talk. The Hadith are his everyday talk as well. Just now the messages are from God. When it came to the Quran, they knew right away, this is not Muhammad's words. So basically, Shakespeare's style of writing is crystal clear. If we found a manuscript, someone said Shakespeare, we could throw it in and confirm or disqualify it from being Shakespeare's, because you can't write in two completely different ways. And so that showed us that the Quran, it would be impossible for the Prophet ﷺ to live 23 years self-policing. You get it? Like this set of words, vocabulary is only for the Quran, and this set of words is going to be for my day-to-day life. I'm only going to use the word door on Sundays for 20 years. Or not going to use the word door on Sundays for 20 years. It's humanly impossible, right? You know, something very interesting, and it gave me chills the other day. I've never heard this before. I shared it with someone to throw it on social media. You know, it was very, very beautiful. It mentions that forget comparing the Quran with the Hadith. Even if you just measure the Quran with the Quran, there's something unbelievable, which is that there are, even in the shortest surahs of the Quran, you think surahs like short surahs, you know, like how much flexibility do you have? Every single surah in the Quran, no matter how short, has words, terms that are used there that are not reused in any other surah of the Quran, in any other of the 113 surahs. You know, he used the example of Al-Kawthar, Al-Abtar, Shani'aka, right? Think of Inna A'tanak Al-Kawthar, shortest surah. Those don't exist anywhere else in the Quran. So how do you do that? And so that's the whole stylometry. The next one is the unwavering eloquence of the Quran. Sister Sundus, we have 12 minutes. Am I right? Firm 12 minutes, right?
Yes, we're ending 9:30, inshallah.
Okay. Should I stop and leave room for questions, or just let them trickle in as they trickle in?
I think as they're coming in, unless there's really a lot of questions people have.
Fantastic. So let me at least get through this slide, and then I will defer everything else, inshallah, to next week, and we'll move much faster next week. I think I moved a bit slower than I wanted to, But inshallah, there's benefit. The point is not to rattle these things off. I hope you're digesting this and committing it, inshallah, to your memory. Unwavering eloquence. So here goes my trauma from being an English major. Every class you go into that talks about Shakespeare, if betting was halal, you could bet big money on them stopping on certain brilliant segments in Shakespeare. You know, like what, to be or not to be in Macbeth, or you know, a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. And those are the segments that all the experts say, oh man, Shakespeare really killed it there. He really, you know, there was a mic, it would have been a mic drop moment. You know, it just, he outdid himself right there. So segments of distinct brilliance. Now compare that with the Quran. In other words, like, it's not all of Shakespeare that's worth stopping at. It's just he really, you know, had some really beautiful passages in how he wielded the language. Does that exist with the Quran? No, it doesn't. The Quran in its entirety has unwavering eloquence. Nothing is suboptimal. And the proof of this is that the Arab, just to get an idea of their culture, the Arab had nothing going for them, I said, but language. Like, they were primitive in so many civilizational respects, and it was language. And they were so brutal with language that they would call, here's a fun fact, not nice, but fun fact. They would call non-Arab Ajam. You guys know there's Arab, then there's Ajam. You guys may hear these terms. Ajam actually means speechless. Like, anyone who's not us, you guys aren't even talking. Like, you guys are inanimate objects. Your language stinks. You guys can't articulate the way we can. But even among themselves, among fellow Arab, they had this brutal, what we call nowadays literary critique, right? A literary critique tradition called the Naqd tradition. Naqd means dismantling. So what they would do is that they'd sit there and listen to each other's poetry and brutally scrutinize each other's poetry. That was okay, but considering the theme, this would have been a better metaphor. This would have been a better analogy. That term, this conjugation of it would have been superior. They just sit there tearing each other's language apart, right? Now, in that climate, nobody has ever identified a passage of Quran that could be bettered, that could be improved on, right? That's also very unique. That's not Shakespeare at all. That's not human. Number 6, challenged his peers. Did Shakespeare say, like, you know, nobody can ever bring this? No, he never said that. And by the way, Shakespeare, here's another like falter that Arbery, you know, Shakespeare is not the undisputed best playwright in all of English by unanimous agreement. No, he's not. Remember, I said everybody agrees that the Quran is in a league of its own, regardless of whether it's from God or not. That's not true with Shakespeare. They don't say Shakespeare's writings are in a league of their own. There are literary experts in English who rank Shakespeare number 7, like Hugh Craig from Newcastle University, I mentioned in the book. So this exists. So Shakespeare was just the number 1, according to many experts, but he recognized, and sort of those who rank him number 1 recognize that it's arguable. It's not conclusive. You know, this is our assessment. But everyone understood Shakespeare was human. Shakespeare, you know, produced things that are producible by human effort. You know, he's a champ to some. He's the number 1. He's the champ to some, but he's in an arena of worthy competitors. You know, the Prophet ﷺ, we already explained this in great detail, that he would shame them at every turn. Come on, you guys are the experts. Bring something like it, anything like it. Bring your own judges. Bring a short passage, right? And yet no one could. Number 7, who had the luxury of using fiction? You know, the Quran is speaking about like uncomfortable truths. You guys know when experts talk, it's very easy to fall asleep. When they're talking about philosophy or medicine or engineering, or the Quran is talking about like existential realities, how to understand existence. It's talking about philosophy. It's talking about, you know, like the diseases in the inner crevices of our hearts. It's talking about world history. It's talking about law and legal technicality. All of that, you would think, you know, it wouldn't really have the appeal that it has, right? Whereas Shakespeare, he gets to write by whatever, he gets to make up stories, love stories, romance, drama, suspense, thrillers. And so the Quran was far more limited in its scope to appeal to the audience. Then bring it to number 8. Who had universal appeal? Despite Shakespeare having, the leeway of fiction, if I were to put together, a play in my masjid, shoot me before I do this, Yani, but a Shakespeare play at my masjid, who would show up? Almost nobody, right? Upper middle class, college educated, Caucasian folks. That's probably who would care, right? And I don't, of course, mean that as like a slight to Caucasian folks, but this is just, it's a cultural preference, right? Now, if I were to do a Quran night and bring some like expert reciters on the Quran, who would show up? Everybody and their mother and their grandchild. Different walks of life, different age groups, different linguistic backgrounds. How did the Quran have such a universal appeal, even to those who don't fully understand it, right? Number 9, okay, I'm down to the wire now. Number 9, who had the leeway or the flexibility of being creative, like creative liberty? What does that mean, creative liberty versus interactivity? Let me try to simplify this. Let's imagine Shakespeare wasn't using fiction, but he still got to choose what he will and will not speak about, okay? Let's imagine that. The Quran now is interacting with its audience in real time. Can you, like, there, for example, 13 passages in the Quran where the Quran says, "Oh Muhammad, they ask you about the moons. Oh Muhammad, they ask you about the menstrual cycles. Oh Muhammad, they ask you about money to be spent in charity. Oh Muhammad, and immediately they ask you about this because they did. So, and there's a response to the question immediately. Can you imagine me trying to give an eloquent lecture, a profound, gripping lecture, and you guys keep asking me questions? Well, this is a study class, right? But can you imagine I'm like telling you about, like, I don't know, paradise and the hellfire, and someone says, "Sheikh, like, do I have to pay zakat on my jewelry?" And then like I answer the question and I get back to my subject and get back to my subject. Someone jumps on and says, "Sheikh, her dad said I can't marry her because, of my skin color." And then, I get back to my subject. How eloquent would this lecture be, right? The Quran is interacting. And by the way, not just interacting to their questions. Those are just like 13, if you count the repeats, like 16 questions. Then you have the events. The Quran is interacting with the events. Like, can you imagine the Prophet ﷺ let's make believe for a second what they're saying. He made up the Quran. Is he expected to be as eloquent in those moments in the night when he's putting the Quran together, supposedly? And those other moments when, he's going through the traumatic experiences of the battlefield where his uncle, or the moments when he's losing family members and he's weeping and alayhi salatu wassalam, and he's praying janazah and he's devastated and he's bleeding. Quran came down in those instances. Should we expect the Quran interacting with events impromptu to be just as eloquent? How do you compare that with Shakespeare sitting there under a candlelight, drinking his chamomile tea, if it existed, writing what he wants to write about? That's number 9. Number 10, this is the kicker. This is the kicker. Who wrote their book in linear fashion, beginning, middle, end? Shakespeare or Muhammad? Not just Shakespeare. Everyone does this. Who doesn't do this? You write your book like this or like this, but the point is it's linear. It's a line, right? Beginning, middle, end. The Quran, you got to know that the Quran didn't come down in the order that we have today. The Quran came down in pieces. It was puzzled together, right? And so imagine a painting or a tapestry, and you painted it like this, right? A piece of this surah, then a piece of that surah, then a piece of this surah, then this whole surah, then a piece of that surah. And all of a sudden, all that pixelation, all that segment, all that randomization in our eyes becomes this masterpiece of a tapestry. Who can write like that? Who can produce literature like that? And the Quran wasn't even written. The Quran was spoken. And so, I'm out of time, but there is There's one ayah in the Quran, and there are many like it, but we don't have time right now. But it is so shaming to those that are in denial after discovering the Quran that it must be from Allah. Allah says about the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salatu wassalam, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. You, O Muhammad, never used to, before this Quran, recite any sort of scripture, any sort of like words, you never recited anything before this day, nor did your right hand ever inscribe anything. وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. Then he says, here it is, إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. Had that been the case, if you ever used to like memorize stuff or write things, in that case, those who call you false, the deniers, al-mubtilun, those who call you batil, the falsifiers, lartab, they would have had a reason to doubt. And this is so powerful, right? Why is it so powerful? Because if the Prophet Muhammad could write, if the Prophet Muhammad was trained in poetry, right? You still wouldn't have much of a reason to doubt, because everyone that can read and write and, is versed in rhetoric has failed. So it's as if the Quran is saying, if you can read and write, they would have had a 1 in a million chance, 1 in a million reason to doubt, source of doubt. But since you couldn't read and write, they don't even have a 1 in a million. So you see sort of, subhanAllah, the what do they call it? The dialectic strength of the Quran, like the debate strength of the Quran. You guys have no basis whatsoever. If he could read and write, you would have a very, very shallow reason to doubt, a superficial reason to doubt. What happens when he couldn't even? Alayhi salatu wassalam. Any questions, final questions before we close out? Here's a teaser for next Thursday. I'm sorry, this Thursday, right? How the Quran was remarkably accurate about historical events that would have been impossible for him to know, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Yes, Sarah.
Wait, could you explain again what you mean that if he was, alayhi salatu wasalam, a poet, they would have a doubt, like a little bit of a doubt? Why?
It's as if the Quran is saying, if you were a literarian, if you were a spoken word artist, right, a poet, they would have had a 1% reason to doubt. You get it?
But why would they on that basis?
This is called tanazzul. Tanazzul is like, what is tanazzul? For argument's sake type line of reasoning. Meaning, because this is sort of closer to being poetry. It is poetic, it is closer to being, but you guys have, so there's one of two interpretations. I need to be honest. There's one of two interpretations to this verse. One of the interpretations is the people of the book would have had a reason to doubt because their books say that the last prophet is going to be illiterate. So since he's not illiterate, since he is illiterate, then you have no reason whatsoever to doubt. The other interpretation for this is that this is speaking to the pagans of Mecca, and it could be speaking to both at once, right? Pagans at once saying, if he had some skill in poetry, if he knew a little bit of poetry, right, you would have had a reason to doubt, meaning because this does have a resemblance to the charm of poetry, or the rhythmic resemblance of poetry. Does the Quran have a rhythm? Yes, it does. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's called, like when you say something for argument's sake. I'm not even saying it's true, but for argument's sake, had you said this, it would have been a hair better, right? That's what the Quran is saying. Meaning the Quran is saying you guys don't even have a strand of hair to hold on to. You guys have nothing. You're being totally preposterous. Anything else? Any other questions?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
How does a person cure that skepticism like the irrational skepticism, even when they logically have the proof to stand against the false arguments. Like when you know it in your mind, but you can't prove it to your heart, so to
Yeah,
speak.
that's a beautiful question. There are, of course, levels of this that would benefit a lot from just clinical treatment. Even people that have OCD, right? They just can't shake off the whisper that they know is debilitating or works against them. And so of what they go through is cognitive behavioral therapy, right? How do you shake off this whisper? And so it's almost like a muscle. You get coached through it. But a little bit of this can be done on your own if you can manage it, which is to not give in to questions that are unproductive, that are not productive, questions that are paralyzing. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ guided us to, and it is actually the very same protocol that psychiatric workers or specialists, psychiatric health providers use, which is self-interruption. How do you interrupt yourself from these thoughts? Because if you give in to them, they get louder and louder and louder. That's a big part of it. But ultimately, these sorts of episodes, I've gone through them in my life as well, to be honest. They are a great reason for a person to recognize their fragility in front of Allah and to ask Allah Azza wa Jal to cure them of it. Like, I don't own my heart. I don't own my mind. That's how fragile I am. Allah does. And so to show your poverty to Allah Azza wa Jal and to ask him to cure you of this, no matter what I tried, I couldn't get rid of it, by the way. And when it finally went, I have no idea why it went. But in the course of that journey, I learned how to make dua. I learned, how conceited I was. And I hope I've benefited from that journey. And so in general, I would, remind you all that a part of this is spiritual enlightenment. It is from Allah Azza wa Jal to just open your eyes and clear your paths. So don't make that the last door you knock on. That's a part of, rather the most important part of the recovery process. Any other questions? Or actually, send this up to you. I don't mind if you don't mind. But if you guys want a firm stop, we can do that as well.
No, mashallah, I didn't imagine we're going to have so many participants in today's class. We have actually over 100 people. We live streamed the class after we saw that we reached capacity and more people wanted to enter. And now people are even writing on the chat, we can go more beyond 1 hour. SubhanAllah. So Jazakallah khair for this amazing class. I think if there aren't any more questions, inshallah, we're going to continue the class on Thursday. And if we need to extend it to like 1.5 hours to, complete your slides, inshallah, we can do that for Thursday, bi'idhnillah.
Sounds good. Jazakallah khair, everybody. I'll let you close us.
Inshallah. So the class will continue on Thursday, inshallah, on the 23rd at 8:30 p.m., exactly like we did for tonight. And this class is in preparation for Ramadan, since Ramadan is the month of the Quran, and we wanted to, give us an opportunity to connect and understand the Quran further, inshallah. We also have one more class coming up in March, which is Fiqh of Zakah, which is also in preparation for Ramadan, since a lot of people have questions in regards to, giving their zakah when it comes to Ramadan, inshallah. So we will send out the recording. It will be on our social media. So if you have somebody who wasn't able to attend the class, they can see the recording, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, our beloved Sheikh. We will just end with